Now that I have all kinds of qualified people around me, I'm going to open our session. So welcome, dear witnesses and members of the public. Welcome to our meeting number 82 of the Standing Committee on Official Languages of the House of Commons. In accordance with Section 108.3 of the regulation and the motion adopted by the committee on September 20th, 2023, the committee is meeting in order to resume its study on the economic development of official language minority communities. There's another witness to be added. And so now, as usual, the meeting will be in a hybrid form in accordance with the House Order adopted on June 15, 2023. The members can participate either in person or with Zoom. And to guarantee a good meeting, I would like to give you some instructions. Before speaking, please wait for me to call your name. If you are on a video conference, please click on the microphone icon to turn your mic on, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Insofar as interpretation is concerned, on Zoom, you have a choice between the floor, English, or French. For those who are in the room, you can either use any one of those channels. We have an excellent audio system here in the room. However, there could be feedback, and that can be very harmful for the interpreters. And so often it's when your earphone or earbud is too close to the mic. If you take it off, you put it next to the mic, it can create feedback, so be careful. So we would like to ask all participants to be very careful when they use their headset. I would also ask you to please speak into your own microphone and to always put your earphones as far from the mic as possible when you take them off. I would like to remind you that all observations must go through the chair. And for the members in the room, if you want to speak, please raise your hand. And for those on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. And the clerk and myself will try to maintain the order. And so, in accordance with our motion on connection tests, I would like to tell you that all witnesses have been tested for their connection. And so now I would like to welcome the Alliance des Femmes de la Francophonie Canadienne, Ms. Boutieb and Ms. Enayer, President. Ms. Boutieb is the Director General. Also, the Provincial Roundtable on Employment from the province of Quebec, Nicholas Salter, Director General, and Mr. Walcott, Director of Commitment and Communications. I would like to explain. We give 5 minutes to each organization for your presentation, and then there will be interactive questions. I am very strict where the time is concerned. That's my job, but that gives us more time for questions, and so that's why we allow all the different political parties to speak. So that's why. So I am strict about the time. 5 minutes, I'll stop you. I'll tell you about 15 seconds before that it will be over, and that's how it will work. So I'd like to begin with Ms. Boutieb, and so you have 5 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you. It's Ms. Enayer who will be speaking instead of me. Okay. Mr. Chair, and members, I am speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and on behalf of the Alliance des Femmes de la Francophonie Canadienne, I would like to thank the Standing Committee on Official Languages for having invited us to present our recommendations around the study on the economic development of official language minority communities. I'm Noor Aye, and I'm the president of the AFFC, and Sukayana Boutieb is here with me. We are a feminist organization that is nonprofit and devoted to growing awareness and promoting the role and contribution of over 1.3 million Francophone and Acadian women living in a minority situation. The AFFC is fortunate to have a network of 15 member organizations. This year, the new action plan for official languages officially recognized the essential contribution of women in official language communities and minority situations. Namely, it is important to see the role that women play in conveying the Francophone identity. Concrete and continual investments in Francophone and Acadian women are necessary in order to recognize that contribution. For communities, there are many issues. The increase in gender-based violence during the pandemic and the absence of the Francophone in the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence is of concern. Also, for our network, the reality of funding is very alarming because our member organizations do not have core funding, and we need that in order to be able to continue to play a role in our communities. Francophone immigrant women also have specific needs that aren't taken into account in immigration programs and services that could allow for a better integration of Francophone immigrant women, but also greater participation in the social and economic life of the country. In Canada, women account for about 54% of caregivers or family caregivers. These women need access to health and French services that respond to their needs. The comparative analysis shows that the services offered by the government are based on relative identity factors for each person. In order to be efficient, they must be applied in an exhaustive manner. The AFFC has the following recommendations to make. First, that the government reserve a specific envelope for Francophone Acadian women's organizations where all federal funding is concerned. Second, that the government ensure core funding for all Francophone and Acadian women organizations in a minority situation and invest $280 million over 5 years from the envelope to provide base funding for Canadian Francophone organizations. Third, that the government apply an in-depth gender-based analysis and ensure that the results are made accessible. And fourth, that the programs and immigration services developed by the federal government respect gender equality and take into account the needs of Francophone immigrant women. Fifth, that the government invest an additional amount to implement the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence, and that the government devote a specific envelope for Francophone and Acadian women organizations in minority settings. Finally, that the government invests in order to facilitate the accessibility to resources and services by Francophone caregivers. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Committee on Official Languages, I would like to thank you for listening to me. Sukana Boutiab and myself, we are here to answer your questions. Thank you. Mr. Wycott or Mr. Salter? Okay, go ahead. 5 minutes. Yes, before beginning my initial remarks, I wanted to point out that it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you in French after. However, my presentation will be given in English.
So, Mr. Chair and esteemed committee members, on behalf of the Provincial Employment Roundtable, I'd like thank you the opportunity to speak with you today. Through my remarks at our discussion, I hope to highlight the issues and needs of Quebec's English-speaking communities as they pertain to employment. First off, a bit more background about who we are. The Provincial Employment Roundtable, otherwise known as PERT, is a nonprofit multi-stakeholder initiative whose main goal is to address issues of employment and employability facing the English-speaking community in Quebec. PERT accomplishes this through researching the major challenges that these communities face and by engaging with our network of over 90 members from across the province of Quebec. Our members contribute their knowledge and expertise through their participation in our 4 sectoral tables, which will group employment service providers, employers, educators, and regional community organizations. Our sectoral tables inform our research agenda and provide feedback on our analysis. They also serve as a place for collective mobilization and the development of solutions and initiatives to help address and increase awareness of the employment issues our communities face. Well, I'm pleased to be here today to have the opportunity to share the most up-to-date employment statistics regarding Quebec's English speakers. The economic trends that these statistics reveal are truly worrying. PERT's quantitative research, which primarily uses Canadian census data, shows that Quebec's English speakers, who represent 57.4% of the total official linguistic minority community labor force in Canada, experience higher levels of unemployment, lower incomes, and higher rates of poverty than the French-speaking majority in Quebec, as well as all other OLMC communities across the country. More specifically, our analysis of the new 2021 census data shows that English speakers had an unemployment rate of 10.9%, which is 4 percentage points higher than that of Quebec's French speakers at 6.9%. English speakers also earn a median employment income that is $5,200 lower than French speakers. These gaps in unemployment and income have been present and growing since at least 2001 and have effectively doubled between 2016 and 2021. A deeper dive into unemployment and income data shows that there are disparities even within the English-speaking community, with English speakers living in the regions, as well as visible minorities, immigrants, First Nations, and Inuit experiencing worse outcomes. While the myth of the wealthy Quebec Anglophone persists, the realities on the ground are much different. We see high levels of income disparity within Quebec's English community and disproportionately higher rates of poverty compared to French speakers, so 10% versus 5.8. And despite representing only 14.9% of Quebec's population, the English-speaking community accounts for nearly 1/4, 23% of the nearly 450,000 Quebecers living in poverty. The data is pretty stark. The English-speaking community in Quebec faces important economic challenges, and these challenges are a threat to its continued vitality in the province. To find appropriate solutions, however, it's important to understand why English speakers have been falling behind in recent years. The research we have done thus far has helped us by three main barriers to employment, driving the downward economic trends for our community. They are, first, a lack of access to specialized and targeted English language employment services. Number two, an ineffective French language learning system, particularly for adults in the labor market, and a lack of diverse program offered to support the language learning needs of individuals in key professions. And lastly, a lack of access to English language skills training programs due to the limited availability of these programs across the province, particularly in the regions. Data shows, for example, that English speakers complete vocational and technical training programs at less than half the rate of Francophones, at 6.2 versus 13.2%, limiting their ability to participate in in-demand trades and careers in Quebec. As you well know, employment is an area of shared jurisdiction, and as such, we believe that to effectively address the challenges and begin to reverse the worrying employment and economic vitality trends we've outlined, governments across all jurisdictions need to work together in a collaborative and coordinated way. The first steps in doing this work involve recognizing employment as a cornerstone of economic development and community vitality in the English-speaking community of Quebec, and developing a strategy that prioritizes impact and accountability. Improving the relationship between federal institutions and the English-speaking community in Quebec concerning economic development. Ensuring coordination and cooperation between the federal government, particularly Canadian Heritage and ESTC, and the provincial government in areas of shared jurisdiction. Investing in research on the employment and economic developments of the English-speaking community, and developing a pan-Canadian plan to strengthen investments in free and accessible adult French language training programs. Over the last 3 years, PERT has built a robust and diverse network of partners whose perspectives and expertise drive our capacity to develop solutions to the problems I have outlined today. We're especially proud of our partnership with the Regional Development Network and YES, an employment organization in Montreal with whom we've deployed a French language confidence building program for job seekers across the province. Nevertheless, all our members and stakeholders stand ready to work with all levels of government to develop and implement innovative solutions that will help address our community's employment challenges. The one missing piece we require to put our vision in place is adequate and sustainable government investment. Thank you for your time. C'est un plaisir de répondre à vos questions en français dans le meilleur de mes capacités.
Merci, Mr. Slaughter.
So I'll be happy to answer your questions.
You can feel free to speak one of both official languages. Feel free to talk in English or in French. OK, nous allons commencer maintenant la première ronde de
We'll
questions.
now start with the first round of questions. Each political party will be able to address questions to any of the witnesses, 6 minutes each, and interactively we'll always start with the Conservative Party, and we'll start with Mr. Bernard Généreux for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. It's really kind of you to be here today. Ms. Benaye and Ms. Boutillet, what is your perception when it comes to the fact that government does not acknowledge the work of French-speaking women across Canada? Is that the feeling that you have? I can start, but I'll let the opportunity to for my president to speak first. I apologize, we're not in the same location, but thank you for your question, Mr. Sir. One of the realities that we experience is that in Canadian society in general, Acadian and French-speaking women are sometimes left behind. When we talk about our needs and our requests, very often we are forgotten. One of the points which I can make, and which we've been very vocal about, was the action plan to counter gender-based violence. This is a plan that's here to eradicate violence. And when you look in the provinces and territories, the services for French-speaking women and Acadian women are very scarce. There's no service that exists for these women in terms of gender-based violence. I think there's still a lot to be done. And when it comes to that plan, I think French-speaking women and Acadian women are invisible. Now, in this plan, there was a budget that was earmarked for the francophones or French-speaking Canadians, including French-speaking women. Did you see that money since the spring? I think for over 30 years now. And one of the things that we've been doing is that since I came to this position, we realized that there's a specific mention of the contribution of women in transmitting the French language in our community. So I think this is a first good step forward. And now we have to wait to see how that is translated in terms of funding. But what I'd like to say is that not all women's organizations, we have 15 across the country. We do not have any in the Northwest Territories, in Labrador, in Nunavut, as due to funding, and it's not all organizations that have core funding. So we're still waiting to see how this funding will be articulated. We're still waiting. What's the core funding amount, which normally you should receive? And based on this amount, what are your expectations currently with regard to the last budgets that we announced? Well, the reality is that women's organizations do not receive core funding. Not all of them receive core funding. Some receive really small amounts of money. Some would receive, for instance, $40,000 annually, which doesn't go a long way. Generally, based on our studies internally, we realized that there's about $350,000 annually, and the basic amount to pay an employee, managing director, and be able to keep the organization afloat takes a lot. And if it is a direct mandate for services addressed to women, or if it's for you to be a spokesperson for this community, I think $350 annually would be the basic core funding required. Now, on a national scale, you said there were about 15 organizations across Canada. No, I'm speaking at provincial level. So AFFC, we are a provincial organization. We have local branches, and we have Pluriel in Manitoba. This is an organization that is only based in Winnipeg, and that's there to provide direct services to women. In New Brunswick, we have an organization called Regroupement Féministe du Nouveau-Brunswick. This is a provincial organization that has a mandate to defend women's rights. So these mandates would change from one region to the other. So you have 15 organizations that depend on you. So your funding, your annual funding, how much is it? Well, with Heritage Canada, it's $342,100. So provincially, you believe that you should have the same amount for each province? I think AFFC, given that we have a national mandate, we should receive more than that. But for provincial organizations, the basic core funding should be $350 to be able to keep afloat. So there's a global amount, because you said there was a step forward because people have been reflecting about the issue, and because you can find the word women in these documents, but there's no amount that is directly apportioned for women. Well, we're still waiting to see how that plays out. Now, how do you think that you can identify with all these global budgets? Did you is it directly with Heritage Canada that you're looking at possibilities to get more money? I think for the other organizations, what you take into consideration is that the amount is not just there for Heritage Canada. There are other state departments involved, and our president mentioned this in her statement, that we need to have automatic funding, which is granted to Francophone women. So all state departments that give grants to the civil society organizations, so they should be automatic. Sometimes we forget this at the end, and so this is one of the recommendations we are making here today. Thank you. So where are your numbers from?
Le recensement du Canada,
Ouais.
donc l'ensemble des
From
chiffres
the Canada census data. So the numbers in your opening statement are from Statistics Canada from the last census. All of this is available on our website, and it's part of our brief, which will be submitted. I'm surprised by these numbers because you talk about Anglophones in Quebec specifically. So, well, I think I'll end here, but I'm surprised by your statistics. Thank you. I think we'll have time to come back. Second question, it will be for Ms. Ariel Cabrera for the Liberals. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, everyone. Welcome to witnesses. I'll turn directly to Ms. Enaye. In your statement earlier, you talked about immigration for Francophone women or French-speaking women. Then there are a number of challenges. Can you speak to those challenges and tell us what are your proposals to address these challenges? AFFC conducted a study on Francophone women's needs specifically, and we discovered that they had significant challenges, especially given the intersectionality issues when it comes to these women. These are women who come through immigration, but who have to carry on other burdens which women who are already more or less established do not have to experience. There's the challenge that comes with immigration and all the needs involved, and all of this is mentioned in a study that we conducted. We hope that we will be able to, when we talk of French-speaking women, we hope that French-speaking women who come here as immigrants will be viewed or perceived differently because their needs are quite unique. Could I maybe add something else? Well, yeah. So as far as some of the practical needs are concerned, there's the mental load, the access to services. Sometimes these immigrant women, women who experience burdens such as succeeding in their immigration journey, but also addressing their family issues. So these are some of the challenges which we can speak to even more if we have more time. My next question has to do with the fact that you mentioned how you would like to see integration played out and how money should be earmarked for the automatically earmarked for the Francophone women. Could you please speak to this point a bit more? Because I'd like to know you are aware of the fact that Canada is a country where the provinces are more or less autonomous and there's money that goes to the provinces. So how can we do this in a way that takes into consideration the needs which you expressed earlier on? Well, I'll give you a very practical example. In British Columbia, we have a single organization which provides services to women experiencing violence, Francophone women experiencing violence, in a province where there's no policy province-wide for French services. This organization will be closing its doors in March due to a shortage of funding, simply because they don't have any core funding in a province where there's no obligation for there to be Francophone services. So all the Francophone women in British Columbia will not have access to services in their language. Ms. Butiap, you mentioned earlier on that bulk of the work that you're trying to do, that there's a fund to eradicate gender-based violence. This weekend, we were able to secure that fund in spite of the fact that the Conservatives voted against it. Could you please speak to this even more and tell us why this fund is important for Francophone women in Canada? Well, yes, of course. If you allow, I'll share testimony that we had during the pandemic and everything that we experienced during the pandemic. AFFC was attacked. We received a suspicious parcel which said the woman's place is in the kitchen and that immigrants should not be part of our country and that if we didn't listen to them, they were going to beat us up. Those were literally the words and messages that we received during the pandemic, and I still have goosebumps when I think of that message. We were attacked as an organization. Now, the reality is, what about the individual women across those provinces and territories in rural and urban areas where there's no service? We need services, we need prevention, we need to change our society's mindset and have a just and fair society. And we need shelters for women. We also need to educate people. We need to prevent and equally raise awareness. I think there's significant investment that needs to go into this, and we should not leave Francophone women by the wayside, because sometimes getting services in French is a luxury in some provinces, and that should not be the case. You equally raised the issue of mental health, which was part of the budget which we voted in spite of the Conservatives voting against it. So, what do you plan in terms of mental health? Mental health is something that we think about only when there's a crisis, whereas in mental health, we need to have prevention services, we need to have therapy services, and the mental load that women have to deal with is significant. The mental load is about thinking, I'm here with you, but I'm equally a caregiver. I'll have to go back home. I'll have to take care of my mother. I need to get medication for her. I have a husband, I have a family, and I equally have to do my job. And all of these things, which my husband would probably not think about. And this is the reality of women on a daily basis. And when you don't have any services, when you don't have anywhere to turn to, and you don't have the funding to do so, and you don't have accessible services, and there are no services available in your region, this is a challenge. And I think this needs to be taken into consideration, especially after the pandemic, because a significant cross segment of the population was affected, and we need services in French, or health services in French for Francophone women. Thank you very much, Ms. Boutilleb. The next questions will come from the second chair of this committee, Mr. Beaulieu. Over to you for 6 minutes. Thank you to our witnesses. My first questions will be addressed to the PERT group. What are your funding sources? Our funding comes from the Quebec province. So I'll say in last fiscal year, 94% was from Quebec. We had some funding from the federal government, from the Canadian Heritage. So some of your partners are on the table. I think in majority we have a mix. If we think of our partners, most services are funded by the Quebec province, and I'll say we turn mainly towards the province. So my next question, will you acknowledge that in order to secure the future of French in Quebec, the integration as well as the teaching of French language for immigrants is important? Well, our focus is on the English-speaking community and not necessarily on immigrants. I think one of the priorities of our organization is to improve the systems for learning French in Quebec. We ask questions to know. Well, I'm sorry, because your study is based on the first official language spoken, and this includes, based on previous data, a third of immigrants in Quebec. Does this equally include the First Nations as Anglophones? Sorry, was that a question or? Yes, because when several specialists and the government of Quebec consider that in order to ensure the demographic weight of Francophones, it takes 90% of linguistic transfers in order to integrate and ensure that the French language is taught to newcomers in the province. But you consider that at least a third of immigrants who are English speaking, who would like to receive services in English, entitled to services in English, and that this is part of your mission.
Yes, obviously for us, that in the English-speaking community, many want to improve their French language skills. Well, there are immigrants, their first official language that they speak is English, but they want to see them included and to create a system where they can welcome them in English and then give them employment services and connect them with French resources. So first, you were talking about professional training. You're not talking about professional training in French, but in English. We want to giving services in English is important to help people to meet economic challenges. But if their professional training is given in English, well, of course, that's going to contribute to them becoming more English, and it will be more difficult to see them integrated in the French community. But before talking about that anymore, because we don't have much time, Mr. Beaulieu, if you interrupt the witness, it's difficult for the interpreter, so I'll try not to do that. When you presented your results, you used indicators that in general give that kind of a result. However, when you use more varied indicators, for example, the first official language spoken is all between the first language spoken, the language at home, etc. But when you talk about the mother tongue, that includes English, well then suddenly it becomes the opposite, because Statistics Canada 2016 for mother tongue, $7,800 more for the Anglophones, and for the median, $947. Your studies, you talk about the first official language spoken. Yes, go ahead. I'm going to let you go. Well, there's still this gap, but that's a different definition we use, because it's we speak of English speaking. So the median excludes diversity in a way. Go ahead. I'm going to try to answer all your questions. So English speaking Quebecers, it's a better illustration of what's happening. When we look at our research, we interviewed someone who had already worked in Quebec as an American and moved to Canada, and for him, the francization wasn't meant for him because he already had an intermediate French language skills. But right now, what's offered in Quebec, it's really basic how to order a coffee. And so what we see includes people who are in between, who need more specialized services. When we talk about mother tongue, when you look at the statistics, you see that the gap where unemployment is concerned. Yes, thank you, Mr. Walcott. We have no more time for your answers. So now 6 minutes from Northern Manitoba with Ms. Ashton. Good day and welcome to everyone. I have questions for the Alliance des femmes de la francophonie canadienne. Thank you very much for your presentation and for your recommendations that were very clear. I would like to say that I'm very disappointed to hear that the action plan proposed by the federal government doesn't include Francophone women. That's a very serious omission, according to me, that needs to be rectified as soon as possible. Over the past few days, we had December 6th, the day when we remembered the Polytechnic massacre, and we acted to put an end to violence against women, and we have to act as a country. We have to recognize what you shared here with us. Now, on this specific issue, other than the need to include Francophone women in the action plan, I would like to ask you a question about funding. Are you in favor of a measure that would have the federal government to sign agreements with the provinces and territories to put an end to gender-based violence? I will let my colleague answer. I'm not sure I understood. Are you what? Are you in favor of the measure where the federal government would sign agreements with provinces and territories on funding especially for fighting gender-based violence against Francophone women. Thank you very much. Well, there are provincial territorial agreements, yes, but a national plan should also have clauses and funding, especially for Francophones in minority situations. That way, the population will have access to those services. Yes, there are provincial and territorial agreements that have been signed, and that's quite normal. But the federal government must be sure that there are language clauses automatically included in those agreements. That way, all Francophone women in those contexts will have access to services in French, where prevention, awareness raising, and also to have access to services after having been victimized. Okay, thank you. You also talked a lot about the challenges for immigrant women. We know that Canada has promised and has an obligation with the modernization of the Official Language Act to reach much more ambitious immigration targets. Recognizing that and recognizing challenges for immigrant women, could you tell us what are the different supports that Francophone women need in the immigration system in Canada? Do you think that our immigration system welcomes Francophone women as it should? I think that I'd like to step back to remind you that Francophone women who are immigrants, a report was published by the Official Languages Commissioner in Ontario and showed that even if their mother tongue is not French, for their women, their children speak French in the community. So I think we have to recognize that. Of course, Francophone women, en fait, there is a great deal of work being done. However, it is quite a challenge. Each woman has her own situation, and integration is one size fits all. There is custom services targeting certain women, and there are recommendations such as when you offer services to women, you have to be sure that they can have daycare or outside of normal hours. And in other words, have a service that meets their needs and also take into account the migrations change. That can change from one day to another. So we need a proactive system, and it's not because we did something yesterday that we have to keep doing the same thing for 15 years. We always have to be sure to adequately meet the needs of immigrant women who ensure the vitality of our communities. Okay, you talked about early childhood. There's a bill on early childhood and on funding and on giving access to early childhood programs. And there's an amendment on daycare that stipulates that the Government of Canada commits to maintain long-term financing of the services for learning and for early childhood, and especially in official languages in minority systems. And the funding must be granted with agreements with provinces and with Indigenous groups. So this is an amendment that clearly states for Indigenous peoples, but also for official language minorities, that we have to be sure to offer the services. And in Canada, outside of Quebec, only 1 second left. Do you support that measure, and do you think it's very important? It's an excellent question. However, we're going to have to wait for the second round. So now it's the second round. We're going to have a second round, 5 minutes, to Mr. Mark Dalton. Thank you very much. And thank you to the witnesses. And so my first questions is for the Alliance des Femmes francophones. And in a study on the economy, we see that women are very capable, but what can the government do? What more can the government do to help women and their families prosper, or in minority situations. I know you've already mentioned it, but I'd like to see whether you have any other things to add. Thank you. I could start. And we have to realize that when we think of policies and programs, we always have to have Francophone women in mind, in our minds. We must automatically say, if we implement something, what will be the impact on Francophone women? Will it be positive, or could it create even more inequality within society? Are we helping them, or are we perpetuating negative impacts? That's the first thing. There's something that is called the Analysis Plus, and what we would like to know is there an exhaustive analysis, because sometimes we're told that there has been this Analysis Plus, but we see that Francophone women have been forgotten. So I think that they should spend more time on that type of an analysis. Thank you. Could you talk to us about or give us a picture of entrepreneurship among Francophone women in minority situations? I don't have anything specific to say, but you have to recognize that women also often live with financial insecurity. Well, entrepreneurship, it has to be encouraged, but they also have to be sure to have a certain financial security, because if entrepreneurship isn't accessible, well, then women have certain responsibilities every day. Also, they need to have access to a pension. There are all kinds of things that can affect women's future financial security. Yes, we should encourage it, but we need to see concrete support for these women to help them succeed. Thank you. Mr.
Employment rates among the Anglophone minority. Now, is your focus as an organization, is it strictly upon the Anglophone minority group, or is it upon just the entire province of Quebec?
The focus of our organization is on Quebec's English speakers, and we focus on their employability. So we think of ways to understand the problems, and we use a lot of the census data to better understand their problems. And we want to mobilize solutions, which, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, include English employment services and skills training, but also need to be paired with French language training that targets specific professions and the workplace.
So your funding is strictly from the province of Quebec?
Province of Quebec, okay. Yes.
So the fact that they're doing this, does this indicate why are they doing this? Is it because they're concerned, or why are they funding your organization?
We clearly presented that data that demonstrates that Quebec's English speakers are underrepresented in the labor market. We're facing a labor market shortage, and the solutions are a win-win situation, I think, for all governments, which is offering better English employment services that are targeted towards the groups, towards the people in the front lines, but by building the capacity of the English-speaking OLMC organizations, but also paired with French language training to help people improve their French language competency and get into certain professions, or to improve their professional vocabulary and confidence. So it's a win-win situation for all governments. The employability of English speakers is actually an opportunity to do economic development, but also protect the French language.
Yeah, so my understanding was that most Anglophones, most young Anglophones growing up are actually quite fluent in French. And so having these statistics is surprising. Are these unemployment rates, is it more among the older generation, or like can you make some sense out of this, or is it more immigrant population that are
Our numbers man here is there's two-thirds of the English-speaking community in the census indicates that they're able to hold a conversation in French. Holding a conversation in French is different from being able to perform at a high level in a career. So there are so again, 1/3 of the population isn't even able to hold a conversation in French, but the other 2/3, it's unclear about their French language competency. So actually, one of the things we want to see is better data collection on French language competency, so we understand how to move people from perhaps beginner to intermediate levels to more expert levels, specifically for the workplace and for a specific profession.
And are the trends getting worse, or are they stable, or what does occur?
The unemployment gap has been present for almost 20 years, doubled in the last since the last census from 2016 to 2021, from 2 percentage points to 4 percentage points. And the employment income gap, median employment income, which is what most economists use, they use median income as a comparative average, as distorting effects. So median employment income is what you use for comparative between populations. The gap on employment income has doubled in the last 5 years as well.
Okay, now would you say that's because they're just not able to engage in the economy like before? Like it's just become more difficult for them, would you say, just being strictly Anglophone?
So beyond using the census as a data point, we do a lot of focus groups, conferences, events. We hold a lot of events across the country in terms of trying to gather information. We've done a survey. The top thing that's identified for us is French language barriers. That's what English speakers tell us themselves in terms of their challenges in the labor market. And that's why we spent a lot of organizational effort trying to build a
obviously
just French language training system.
Okay, it's all we
Okay,
got.
I guess not.
Thanks, Mr. Salter. Thanks, Mr. Dalton. Les prochaines questions nous viendront pour 5 minutes également de
Next
Monsieur-
question for 5 minutes, Mr. Maxeri. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their work. It's really interesting to look at both organizations. The work that you're doing is quite relevant for your communities. So I'd like to heartily thank you, as well as the recommendations that you've made to this committee. This will help us going forward. My first question is addressed to Mr. Salter.
And I'll just pick up a bit about Mr. Dalton's, the bleak numbers but what there's a perception out there, and I like when you look at Anglophones in Montreal, do they need support versus Anglophones in La Gaspésie, les Laurentides? Alors, there's seems to be a discrepancy on either it's a perception or the support needed. We have McGill in Montreal and versus other institutions outside the regions. Do you have stats that are looking at more regional outside of Montreal?
Absolutely.
And then what recommendations do you have for us to be working more closely with the province of Quebec to look at supporting Anglophones outside of Montreal, if that's
So your question, you're interested specifically in Anglophones outside of Montreal? Okay, so yeah, the regional aspect is obviously a pretty important one. So actually some of our stats, we have a breakdown by region, but the situation in terms of the unemployment gap and the income gap can widen significantly. Gaspésie being one example of where there's significant gaps. There's even bigger than what we see at the provincial level. And what's needed there is different perhaps what you need in an urban setting. Though I argue there are still needs in the urban setting, particularly for visible minority communities or other sub-communities within the English-speaking community. But in the regions, it's just about lack of access to opportunity and lack of access to services. And that's why we strongly believe that there's an existing, we work with regional partners, there's an existing network of OLMC organizations across the regions that could be better supported to work on employment with a 4S bias model. And we think the federal government could play an important role in that. But obviously, we don't want to duplicate services either, right? So you want to make sure that the existing services that are being offered by the Quebec government are and that jurisdiction is respected, while giving the English-speaking community an opportunity to build its own targeted services that meet its unique needs. And in fact, each region is different as well, so it can get complicated fast. But that's why you need a tailored approach for each region.
And if I just may add just a specific...
Just quickly, yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, the English speakers experience higher unemployment in every region of Quebec, with the top three being Côte-Nord, Gaspésie, and Montreal, actually, in terms of unemployment.
The statistics in Montreal, because there's a perception that they may not need that support, but that's something you could provide with the committee itself. Madame Boutier, vous avez parlé, merci beaucoup.
Madame Boutier, thank you very much for the recommendations you made and for the work that you're doing, because when we look at the Francophone women, I think you are right on several counts that we need to do more and better. One of the recommendations which we didn't talk about today, you talked about gender-based violence, but so what are your recommendations when are there any specific recommendations the federal government can make as far as caregivers are concerned? So there's more services to provide. I think caregivers are often isolated, and we saw the hard work that they put in during the pandemic. We had all acknowledged that they did a lot, but having access to support services in French, also for people who are trying to assist patients, is equally tricky, and both in urban and rural areas. Also, when it comes to recommendations which were provided for these caregivers, also with the tax returns, the amount that they need to declare is sufficient. So most of them have to leave work in order to take care of the close ones, and very often it is women who have to do that job in the family. Are you able to give us a picture of funding? Because you talked about the general federal funding, but what about the provincial funding? Because apparently there's some present provinces from which you do not receive any support. Can you maybe give us a clear picture of provincial support when it comes to funding, and then tell us what the federal government can do in its collaboration with other provinces? Certainly, out of the 15 member organizations, only 7 of them receive funding from Heritage Canada, but for the others, we will do a follow-up and get back to you on the question. Thank you. 6 minutes already? Well, I'll move over to Mr. Dalton, so I'll make sure that everyone has an equal amount of time. The question here, when it comes to funding, earlier on, there's nothing in terms of support. You said that in order to support the Anglophones who speak English as a second language, what can we do in terms of employment? There's equally the aspect of Montreal as opposed to the regions. We always get a lot of statistics because it's a completely different reality. And I would like to hear a bit more about the support that's required for Anglophones to ensure in terms of bilingualism and employment outside Montreal. So outside of Montreal, we have really strictly Francophone communities, and would be surprised to realize that you still have unilingual Anglophones in those regions who learn French as second language and who need employment services, and the needs are quite different. Thank you, Mr. Salter. I allowed you 1 extra minute, and we are drawing the elastic here a bit too much. So since I allowed 1 minute extra, I'll give you 3 minutes, Mr. Beaulieu. Thank you very much. And a point of information following up on Mr. Dalton's question, I think that funding arrived through Ms. Catherine Wild, who's formerly worked at Alliance Québec, was part of this program, and the Legault government decided to continue with that funding. But I consider that from the picture you're painting is false and biased, because if you look at other indicators, the median, it's recognized. It doesn't take into consideration on the Anglophone side the higher wages, and this does not take into consideration the disparity. The median doesn't take into consideration the disparity, because Statistic Canada, the data is not yet available. But in terms of mother tongue, working language, and language, day-to-day language, there's a different portrait. There's a researcher who calculated saying, well, if you're working in English or if you're not working in English, what are the consequences? And what he discovered is that for Francophones working in English, this is an advantage for them compared to if they only spoke French. And working mainly in French for newcomers, those working exclusively in English in the Montreal area, it's more profitable than working exclusively in French. Recent study from the Office québécois de la langue française, for those who work only in English, earn annually 46%, which is 20% more than the average income of those working exclusively in French. So in the facts, I think in your work, when you target newcomers and immigrants, this is countering the efforts of the Quebec government to ensure the influence of French with this same group. So in order to understand the needs on the ground, I think, and also to humor you, I think if we look at this data, well, excluding immigrants, if we only look at those who speak French as mother tongue, I think the data includes immigrants. If we look at French as a mother tongue, we still have schools. Our data is not false. I have indications or data to the contrary. In 2016, we have data from 2021, and It all depends. I mean, numbers. You can make numbers tell any story. You tell any story you want them to tell. When you look at the average revenue, if Bill Gates were in the room with us today, for instance, and we look at the average income of everyone, we'll all be millionaires. When I look at my bank account this morning, I don't have any millions. So the average could actually make the data look false. But there's economic inequality between the English-speaking community, which yes, we agree that there's some people who are really poor. So if we look at the average, that enables us to target those who have certain needs when it comes to learning the French language. Thank you, Mr. Salter. If you have documents to send to us, you can send them through our clerk so that you can share them to all committee members. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Ashton, over to you, please. Thank you. And I'd like to carry on with the question on funding the daycare systems. And when we look at the amendment that was tabled to the House of Commons, which will be examined in Parliament, we need to have targeted funding when it comes to daycare services, Francophone daycare services in Quebec. And we all know that this recommendation is supported by AFFC. And I would ask Ms. Boutieb or Ms. Enaya to know if the AFFC considers that this amendment is relevant. I'll say yes, absolutely, because I work with refugee women, and each time one of the challenges had to do with daycares, spots in daycare. So if Francophone women across the country were to have, be able to get some respite with daycare services that will enable them to be able to work. I don't know if my colleague something else to add. So one of the things that we need to ensure is that this is a permanent solution. We cannot provide universal daycare services for 5 years and then tell the women to, do their best to manage all by themselves later on. So everyone has to be able to have access to daycare services wherever you find yourself across Canada. Thank you very much. We know that another challenge is the issue of affordable housing, and considering once more the fact that we would like to invite more Francophone families from across the world, do you think that we should have practical measures in place from the federal government when it comes to affordable housing? Absolutely. I live in Vancouver, so I am very much aware of the challenges involved in when it comes to families living in British Columbia, but also elsewhere in the country. And given the inflation which we are experiencing right now, I think women are seriously affected by this inflation as well as the cost of housing, even more than the general population. 30 seconds. We can't hear anymore, Ms. Ashton. Oh, sorry. So with my last 30 seconds, I'd like to table a motion to the clerk that the committee should send a report to the House of Commons for the suppression of significant jobs at CBC Radio, and we're concerned with the implications as far as access to information for Francophones in Canada and Quebec, as well as for workers who will be affected by these job losses. The motion calls on the Director General of CBC Radio to provide reasons for these job losses as well as her plan going forward. I think we can debate this motion or discuss this motion. So this is a notice of motion. Ms. Ashton, is that it? Yes, thank you. So before we conclude, I'd like to thank the AFFC through Ms. Boutayeb and Ms. Enaye, the Provincial Roundtable on Employment with Mr. Salter and Walcott. This is the first time that we're receiving you here. Thank you for coming and thank you for taking part in this exercise. I'd like to wish you all a happy holidays. Mr. Bernard would like to add something.
Yes, on behalf of Canadian men, I would like to apologize for what happened at your office. I understand that you received a package and it was a suspicious one, and with a letter that told you that women should return to their kitchens. And I know that the Quebec and Canadian society has evolved a great deal, and we're very far from something like that. And to see a package sent to you, I assume it's by man. I can tell you that it's not the case for the majority of Canadian men, and we hope that you will never have that happen again. Thank you. So we are going to suspend. Yes, I think that all those here around the table are in agreement. I would like to tell you that we support you from the Bloc Québécois, even though I was speaking more to the Quebec organization. We support Francophone women. I think we will see your support with concrete recommendations. Okay, we'll suspend. We're going to bring in fund. Where employability is concerned, in 2023, the CDA created closer ties with the Francophone organization Accès Emploi Alberta. These closer ties will make it possible for the Francophone community to be better served because the issues where issues of entrepreneurship and employability are linked. Although we have our head office in Edmonton and an office in Calgary, as a provincial organization, we also work in rural areas. Since its creation, our organization has an employee to serve the Northeast and another contractor in the Northwest. This allows us to have an impact on the diversification of the economy in rural regions. We are now working in the Smoky River Regional Economic Development. We have we work with financial literacy workshops. We give workshops on entrepreneurial, as well as camps for young entrepreneurs. These initiatives, which have allowed us to reach 2,500 students in primary and secondary schools, has allowed for the creation of school businesses. The CDA also manages the Francophone Economic Development Fund, which comes with an envelope of $1.8 million for 3 years. It's the implementation for the prairies of an initiative in economic development known as the EDI program that makes it possible to fund economic development initiatives such as the creation of a sewing cooperative for African women or the creation of a Francophone Visual Arts Center. And I will let my colleague continue. The ABMA, Association Bilingue des Municipalités, is a non-profit association that represents member municipalities from all over Alberta. Our message is simple and clear. Bilingualism is a motor for economic growth. The ABMA plays a crucial role in the economic development of Alberta because we know that by putting bilingualism at the heart of municipal economic strategies, communities can create employment, attract employees, improve tourism, and optimize investment opportunities. ABMA, it's no surprise, Alberta's bilingual municipalities have a huge network of organizations, institutions, and businesses that are successful by offering French services. However, more needs to be done to showcase these networks and the successes at the national level, and there are several reasons for that. Most importantly is that very few people in our province or in Canada know just how large and dynamic Francophone communities are in Alberta. The ABMA wants to guarantee that municipalities have the resources and tools they require to be able to be responsive to the needs of newcomers, tourists, and Francophone universities. We also have to recognize the commitment of our country toward the two official languages and to build a meaningful and collaborative relationship between Alberta's Francophone communities to ensure that the communities are economically sustainable for many generations to come. Bilingual communities are better situated to identify areas for increased synergy and cooperation in order to optimize the scope and impact of services offered to the Francophone population, because they are the level of government that is the closest to French businesses and residents. By acting in cooperation with the local and provincial governments, Francophone communities throughout Alberta can generate new ideas, perspectives, solutions as to what it means to succeed in Alberta. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Brosseau. And now for the Société de la Francophonie Manitobaine, Daniel Boucher.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Standing Committee on Official Languages to have invited me to appear today. My name is Daniel Boucher. I'm the Director General of the Société de la Francophonie Manitobaine. As a spokesperson organization for the Francophone community in Manitoba, our organization looks after furthering all fields of activity in the community with the help of our huge network of collaborators and partners. I'd like to talk about three main subjects: the implementation of the action plan for official languages, federal, provincial, territorial agreements, and the lack of research on the economic impact of the Francophonie. I will be brief in order to be able to answer your questions. Our organization would like to acknowledge the leadership of the federal government in having the Bill C-13 adopted, as well as the OLAP. These are indispensable tools to promote and encourage no community. However, the delay in the implementation of the action plan is increasingly worrisome because it means that it limits the economic development of Manitoban Francophonie and elsewhere in Canada. Our community organizations, through all the work they do to offer stimulating jobs while reinforcing each aspect of the community life, are catalyzers for economic vitality in our province and our country. It has to be pointed out, bilingualism is an essential part of the competitive advantage that Canada has. French represents an economic asset that we should be counting on. Given the drop in the demographic size of Francophonie in Canada, there is urgent action needed on the part of the federal government. Of course, economic prosperity of our communities relies in large part on the offer of services in French, including in education and health. These services make it easier to welcome new bilingual arrivals. That has a major impact not only on the competitivity of our economy, but also on the capacity of our local businesses to grow and to flourish. That being said, our communities are still waiting for new agreements on services in French and for federal and provincial funds that would flow from them. In the meantime, community organizations and the workers who support the community are suffering from insecurity. Also, the absence of language clauses in the Canada Health Transfer is a great lack because it is difficult for people, French-speaking people, to obtain services in their first language. So we would like to encourage the federal government to conclude the agreements and to add language clauses to those agreements that don't have any, and to support municipalities so they can offer services in French. We today see a revolution that's fundamentally changing the way we work and claim our rights. There is more and more data being produced nowadays, and yet there is a striking lack of understanding of the economic weight and impact of Canadian Francophonie and bilingual entrepreneurs. Despite the work of organizations such as the Réseau de développement économique et employabilité and its members, among others, more must be done in order to promote the collection and the analysis of conclusive data. The report of the Conference Board of Canada on English-French bilingualism outside of Quebec from 2018 is an excellent example of a robust analysis that provides a better idea of our reality than just anecdotes. The analysis and integration of research in the logic of our work are what allow our organizations to meet the real needs and to work with the different levels of government to find winning solutions. That could be done by encouraging collaboration among our organizations that work on economic development and Statistics Canada. I will stop here. I would like to thank you for your attention and for offering us the possibility to present today. I'm happy to respond to your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Boucher. Now, for those who are virtual, we will have a first line of questioning, and we will begin with the first vice president of this committee. So you have 5 minutes. So I would like to thank our witnesses for their generosity, for us to be better, and for us to make recommendations that will help you.
Monsieur Allary,
que j'ai eu le privilège de rencontrer cet été à Calgary avec
I'll
une
greet Mr. Alary, whom I met with a roundtable with stakeholders. Mr. Alary, this will be an opportunity for us to go a bit further following that meeting. Could you mentioned in your statement, introductory statement, that you have a full-time employee with a contract worker. So is that okay? Is that enough? In my presentation, thank you very much for your question. I talked about an employee in the north, west, and northeast. We have about 12 permanent employees, 4 in Calgary, 5 in Edmonton, 6 in Edmonton, and the other employees I talked about were to provide services to the rural areas. It is certain that with better economic outlook, we could do more. But since our financial position is stable over the past years, having an employee in Fort McMurray or in the Grand Prairies would mean taking away from our staff in the province. So you cannot, cheat, rob Peter to pay Paul. So we all know that there's a demographic change happening in our communities, and to stay relevant, I could talk about the aspect on employability, which is a key issue on which we need to work on during the coming year. But I know that we're short of time, so I'll end my response here and I'll probably address other questions that you may have. Thank you, Mr. Alary. The reason why I'm asking this question, I was wondering because you had a mandate from Heritage Canada, from the Department of Innovation, which assigned you the management of the program Prairie Can. Can you tell us more about this mandate and the responsibilities, rules, and responsibilities under this agreement? So it's the creation of the Economic Development Fund for the Prairies, which over the previous years was considered the Economic Development Fund for West Canada. But we have diversified our activities in 2 regions, the Prairies and Pacific Can. And for Prairie is Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Manitoba. And this was initially managed by ESDC, and we're working with other economic partners for the other 2 provinces for our projects from the communities and provinces. We are trying ultimately to have a more even distribution of the $600,000 budget to encourage certain projects, which I mentioned during my presentation. We would like to create a corporation for tailoring for Francophone women. Well, I'd like to stop you because time is quite limited here. So I'd like to come back to an announcement which you made last year on the creation of the Alliance de la Francophonie économique canadienne with your colleagues from New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec. How do you differentiate this alliance from RDEE in Canada? So RDEE Canada is the Network for Employability and Development, and it is based on employability and economic development. But the alliance is on commercial and trade development, especially business meetings with Francophonie, which is held in Quebec every 2 years. I know that the Federation of the Commerce of Chamber invite Francophone entrepreneurs who want to do business in Alberta. Now, the nuance between both organizations is that René will help people to start a business, and the organization is to establish connections between Francophone networks. So I think this is a great initiative. Congratulations. And very quickly, French. We know that in Alberta, French is a minority language, and now you have many tourists visiting your region. So is there a merging, or is there a possibility of using French for your tourism industry? We set up a few years tourist guide in French for people to be able to discover certain places in French. We have a bilingual tourist guide, or tourist guidebook, and we have quite some tourism volume, and the Lakes region was closed for some time. And our idea is to take tourists elsewhere in the province, and we are collaborating with Travel Alberta, which is the provincial agency when it comes to tourism in Alberta. I talked about bilingual documents on tourism, which allow francophone entrepreneurs to distinguish themselves, and we also try to highlight the work of certain craftsmen and women. And we have a cheese factory and also a bee farmer in the province. And there are several great initiatives which make it possible for us to serve our French-speaking clients. And since this year, Travel Alberta has been able to make the Francophone segment one of its priorities in its business model. And we've had some collaborations with this provincial agency to continue collaborating with them. Very quick question. What is the reaction of Anglophones in Alberta when it comes to this initiative? I know that several Anglophone, excellent questions, Mr. Godin. We'll come back to that. Time is over. Mr. Drouin, 6 minutes for the Liberals. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the witnesses joining us online. Just have a question, just to understand the ecosystem in Alberta. You made mention of the IDE program and then the Economic Development Council of Alberta. We have in Quebec the SRDC. Is it the same thing in Alberta? And are there any SRDCs that are more sensitive to the Francophone lens in minority situation? The IDE program is a federal program and has to do with community futures, like what we have here in Alberta to service rural areas. And then you have bilingual entities that work with us to encourage bilingualism. And when I think specifically of the northeast and northwestern part of the province. So you have a good working relationship with them, where there would be more francophones in those regions. So you have a good working relationship. Yes, we want to collaborate because bilingualism goes both ways, into French and into English. So we decided to really focus on collaboration. So in Manitoba, I want to make sure that we have a few questions. Just to really understand well, in Manitoba, we have to understand the ecosystem well. Do you have federal programs that you roll out there, Mr. Boucher? Well, not us directly, but we have the Economic Development Council, as well as the Association des Municipalités Bilingues du Manitoba, which we work with municipal governments, and we have federal programs as well as provincial programs that we run, and which are not directly serviced by us, but sometimes coordinated by us through the Association des Municipalités Bilingues, which works together with the Canadian Association of Municipalities, as well as the Manitoban Association. So this entire ecosystem involves all these economic players. And for us at the Association Francophonie Manitobaine, we have a coordination role to play, and we work with these groups in order to put out more cross-cutting points and more political aspects when it comes to ensuring that we have the programs and services in place to support us. So how do you perceive? I'll take an example in Ontario. I always say that it's much easier because I have 60% of Francophones in my riding, even though that's a lot. We still have challenges, but you, the Francophones, they're scattered across Manitoba. So what are the gaps sometimes for you to be able to have good service or quality service? Well, there are many municipalities, and we have, I think we have about 17 bilingual municipalities, and I think there's been orders or municipal councils that offer meeting minutes in French as well. And we're working in partnership with our Anglophone friends in these municipalities. And we always highlight the importance of Francophonie in our communities to ensure that we all provide better services, period. I mean, and for us, French services are important, but that helps to improve service delivery in French and in English as well. So we consider that we've made significant strides with our friends in the Anglophone municipalities. And they have orders to declare their municipalities bilingual. This is not easy work, but I think we are making good progress. A question for Ms. Brosseau. Talking about municipalities, I'd like to know what is the role in terms of economic development in your network of bilingual municipalities? Does this vary from one municipality to the other? Or for some, it's only about translating a website and then it ends there? Or do we have more activities in terms of economic development?
Well,
Of
we have a
course,
couple
for francophones.
and we have a couple different initiatives. Some are more broad and do encompass all our members. We have 19 municipalities in Alberta who see themselves as being bilingual. And so, yes, in that case, for everybody is to help translate their website to be English and French. But we do have some projects that could be more specific to a certain region or a couple municipalities who are more closely neighboring than others. We are still in our infancy. We've had projects in the past, but we are currently waiting some results on some grant applications that we have with Heritage Canada and Prairies Can in order to continue some of those larger projects for all our members.
D'accord. Merci beaucoup.
All right, thank you so much. I think I have time for just one question. Mr. Allery, you talked about the need to create ties between Francophone communities because sometimes we tend to export or to go elsewhere other than our own country, but we forget that Francophones in Alberta can provide services to Francophones in Quebec, or that Quebec, as a result of the fact that many of them don't speak English, sometimes communities, minority communities can help them weave those ties. Do you see it as a benefit to have created BEC in 15 seconds? Yes, I think even in terms of the business meet and greet, which is our major business people's event, we often host delegations, and it is often an eye-opener for many people. We have delegations from Quebec, notably the Federation of the Chamber of Commerce in Quebec, because we try to encourage those exchanges. Thank you, Mr. Allery, second Vice President for the Bloc Québécois. Over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you to our guests who are here and sharing their knowledge with us. Now, regarding the association, I think it's from Manitoba. I'm looking for the name, Société de la Francophonie Manitobaine. We've been told that in its mission, they ask all government levels the right to communicate in French and to offer full range of services in French. I'd like to know, what is the situation? Do all Francophones have access to services in French, or is it a minority? And what is the impact on economic development for Francophones in Alberta and Manitoba? So it's for both organizations, my question. Well, essentially, the answer is no. But the answer is also that what we're doing is we're building arguments to show that there should be more services offered in French, which has an economic impact. Especially, we have to realize that people want to live in French, and one of the things that's important is that they must be able to have services in French, to have schools that offer their education in French, everything, so they can live in French in their various communities. So for us, it is work that has known some success, but it's going to take a long time. There has been injustice in the past, and so we had a lot of work to do to build up our relationship. But now I think we have the right approach and we're making progress. When we talk about having French services, Winnipeg just announced that they will be offering services in French and improve them, and that's very encouraging. And what about organizations linked to Alberta? I don't know if there's anything to be said there. Well, services in French are evolving. There's a new policy on francophonie that began in 2018. That's new for the provincial government. We work with our spokesperson organization, the CFA, that works at all levels in both urban and rural areas. As I said, what is pertinent is that we try to have closer ties between our organizations. There are some services we think that could benefit from that. Earlier, we had an organization from Quebec that gave a very detailed report on the situation of Anglophones in Quebec, their economic situation, etc. Have you the same type of study in your case? Is there some kind of picture that shows what francophones' economic situation is? Because sometimes studies show, for example, that there is growth in their economic development, but because they're working in English. Do you have something like that? Well, as my counterpart said, he mentioned a conference board study, and our network would like to work. We do have conclusive data, but we have data from Statistic Canada that shows that in Alberta, there were 6,800 bilingual entrepreneurs, and where 50% of the owners were francophone. Those are just basic data, but I think we need a more in-depth study to see the economic impact. I don't know if Mr. Boucher would like to add anything to what was said, given in the presentation. I think that we can't work on the future without knowing the current situation and future trends. So it is critical for us to be able to develop our strategies using conclusive data that show what is really happening, and that way we can prepare for the future. It's very, very important. And that's part of what we're doing. Now, what you're saying is that your situation is even more important because there are fewer francophones. If you want to have more, you have to do a lot. So what do you think of the principle where they say the numbers have to justify it? Have you had situations where there's been less French in some areas, and so some services were cut 30 seconds? Essentially, it's not necessarily the case. The governments have certain obligations, and they have to meet those obligations. The federal government has the obligation, the province has certain obligations, and the cities as well. So in our case, it's not necessarily an argument we use. We talk about the number of people, of the personnel, but we're developing strategies to ensure that the human resources will be there where needed. Thank you, Mr. Boucher. Now, for the NDP, Ms. Ashton, 6 minutes. Thank you very much.
Je suis très contente qu'on entende du Manitoba aujourd'hui.
Witnesses, I'm very happy to have heard from Manitoba today, and I would like to welcome Mr. Boucher and Ms. Cassie from the Société de la Francophonie Manitobaine. I have a few questions for you, but the first question, as you know, the purpose of our committee is to develop recommendations for the federal government so that it will be able to do what it needs doing. Mr. Boucher, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned all the work that you have done and that the communities across the country have been doing through the CFA, what you have done in order to improve and to reinforce the new bill on official languages. I would like to thank you for your work. However, you also expressed a concern because this bill has not been implemented, and you talk about the impact on core funding for Francophone organizations. Could you tell us exactly what that means for you, and what are the recommendations you would like to see us make in order to cut back on the amount of time needed? Essentially, I think that everything is in place. The plan is there. The action plan is there. The bill is there. The law is there. And so it's unfortunate to see this delay because it can affect several organizations and their operations. It can, in fact, lead to job losses. For example, we can talk about federal direct programs, but also federal, provincial, territorial programs, where it is recognized that there's always a delay because there are negotiations with the provinces. That's a problem for us because we have seen organizations that had to put an end to their activities, and that's what concerns us quite a bit, or a great deal, because maybe people don't realize it, but our organizations have an impact on the development of our communities, whether cultural, economic, in all sectors. And it's a concern, and I'm going to give you the example of health. That's a very important field, and when there are delays, it causes problems, especially because the health body is very cumbersome, and so it ends up taking months. So this just isn't acceptable. So my recommendation would be to find how to accelerate the process. Thank you. Obviously, our study looks at economic development. We know that economic development is always linked to education and to access, and here in Manitoba, but elsewhere in Canada, in the West, there's a shortage of education manpower for early childhood, for French in our French school boards, Francophone school boards. So do you have an opinion that you could share? Do you have a recommendation? Is it important for the federal government to face this manpower shortage and to make sure something is done about it? Well, very quickly, and my colleagues from Alberta will be able to add their thoughts. I think that something that's very important for education and for health is to accelerate the process for certifying. Teachers come from all over. We have shortages everywhere in Canada, so you can't necessarily take from one province, but our Francophone immigration rate is very high here in Manitoba, not high enough, but still high. And what we're asking is that the federal government play some kind of role with the provinces and with the professional associations, and they have to always talk about the importance of accelerating the accreditation, the certification process, because we want to be able to have people enter our system. I know several people who are perfectly capable of teaching in our schools. However, they don't have the required certification. So I think that's a large part of the problem. And very quickly, do you think that daycare services help our community's economic development? Yes, absolutely. That's where it all starts. I think that we live in a society that is evolving rapidly when we look at families and how they work outside. And I think that Francophone daycares are essential. It's something we cannot overemphasize. It's a very important economic tool, and it allows people to work outside their homes and their own rhythm, and that's very important for us. 40 seconds. Thank you very much. Just rapidly, Mr. Boucher, if I had more time, I would speak to the others. Are you concerned by the Radio Canada's cutbacks at Radio Canada and the impact on Manitoba and elsewhere. 5 seconds. Yes, that is of great concern to us. Radio Canada is part of our daily life, and the more cutbacks there are, the less we'll be able to communicate in French, and yet it's essential. Thank you very much, Mr. Boucher. Okay, you've been very disciplined. We can have a second round. Ms. Goodrich, 5 minutes. Go ahead, Ms. Goodrich. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the witnesses here today, and it's extraordinary to have a panel from the West entirely, especially from Alberta, from the official languages communities. Often we hear from Quebec and Ontario, but not always from Alberta. So I would like to dwell on that. Either Etienne or someone else, could you talk about the projects underway in Alberta around tourism
Impact dans les communautés.
and how that has an impact on smaller communities? Yes, I could begin. I talked about the impact on our entrepreneurs who want to have businesses. For example, in Vermilion, there's a cheesemaker who is looking for ways to have more customers. We have 5 projects, so 6 on the way. Even an Anglophone entrepreneur who sees the advantage of bilingualism can become part of this project, and then everything is bilingual, all the signage in Calgary. We have one in Bridgeland for a store and its products for the Francophonie. Everything is bilingual in that district, so it is added value for tourists in rural areas. I spoke about Calgary, but in rural areas there are Francophone entrepreneurs who use it, and so it's very successful. It's part of bilingual tourism, so that way tourists who arrive in Alberta will be able to follow a circuit, go by Edmonton, Calgary, Cold Lake, and they can ask what will be suggested, and then all kinds of services are offered or suggested. I don't know if you're talking about municipalities. Well, very quickly, I'd like to add something before my questions for Alyssa. Yes, Fort McMurray and Cold Lake, often when
Jusqu'à Cold Lake.
and I go from Fort McMurray to Cold Lake, I stop off at different places, and there are little signs in different Francophone businesses or bilingual businesses, and you know that you'll be able to use French. So there are many people who stop there, especially because of that. For example, in Plamondon, in Bonnyville, in Lac-La-Biche, in St. Paul, in Cold Lake, there are all kinds of businesses. Perhaps, Elisa, you could talk to us about how that works in the rural areas.
Yeah, that's right, Leila. We did do a campaign where we have stickers. Also, we have something on our website that businesses can go ahead and download as far as a badge that they can put on their website to promote that they do actually have bilingualism in the business, where a tourist or somebody new to the municipality can get some type of service in French and in English. But I do want to tell you about an application that we do have with Heritage Canada to do a larger scale awareness campaign.
Excusez-moi,
as
Monsieur le Président, l'interprétation ne
Just a
fonctionne
second,
pas.
Mrs. Brosseau. There's no interpretation right now. Just a second. OK, on est revenu. Allez-y.
Okay, merci. We currently have an application with Heritage Canada to do a larger awareness campaign. What we're finding as municipalities is that a lot of tourists and newcomers come to Alberta and they don't actually realize how much bilingualism, Francophone speaking people and schools and culture there actually is here in Alberta. And that's a project that we would like to work on this next year to have a larger national scale awareness campaign to show people that there in fact are there's French speaking people here and you can access services both in French and in English here in Alberta. Merci.
Thank you. And I think like most of you guys have touched on the Conference Board of Canada's report where it talks about how bilingualism has economic advantages, and that is exceptionally clear. And just like you've pointed out, most people do not realize that French was the first European language spoke in the province of Alberta. French was how we were founded. Most of our largest cities have French as a heritage. Calgary's Rouleauville was completely French. The first missions in most of our largest cities, and all the way to the smallest ones, are French. And so
Merci, Madame Goodrich.
Sharing is very important. Je m'excuse.
Merci,
C'est
Madame
vraiment
Goodrich.
important de partager en anglais et en français.
Thank you, Ms. Goodrich. You are right to be proud. Mr. Iacono, over to you for 5 minutes. Thank you, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for their presence this morning. My first question is addressed to Mr. Allary as well as Mr. Boucher. In service provision, what is the relationship that you have with your provincial government? Do you have a healthy relationship with them, and are they reliable? Mr. Allary? Well, in Alberta, I mentioned that we have a policy, Francophonie policy, which is quite recent, which aims at better highlighting increase in service provision in French across the community. As a French-speaking organization in Alberta, we don't receive any funding from the province, but through Employment Alberta, in terms of employability, the funding is essentially provincial. It comes from agreements between the province and a federal government. So, but we need to build long-term relationships. We need to continue insisting on the importance of French. And in Alberta, I think there's a provincial organization which recognizes that we have a specific niche in the Francophonie. So these are small gains that we can make. Some projects have been developed in the past in collaboration with the government, and we had a project in the northwestern part of the province. The provincial government funded that project, and there were over 20 municipalities involved in the project. Mr. Boucher will allow you some time to respond. Well, essentially, we have a new government that is barely 2 months old. And I think things have started on the right foot with this government as far as dialogue is concerned. And they are open to ideas and concepts. The previous government, which was there for 7 years, we had some gains, and we need to acknowledge those gains. As far as economic development is concerned, for instance, I think one of the previous government, that was one of the flagship initiatives. And in general, I think we have really good working relationships with the previous and current government, and we hope to be able to add to that mix the federal government as well as municipalities in order to achieve our overarching goals. Ms. Brousseau, several COL systems are in rural areas. So what are your initiatives to support these communities?
Well, we have a couple of different initiatives, as I mentioned. One is helping to showcase to municipalities the importance of having a website, both French and English, having signage on the outside of their of the municipal building to say, welcome, and both English and French. Last year, we did do a project where we worked with 6 different municipalities and help translate some of their signage within the municipality to French and English, including museums and different type of municipal buildings. And again, we're just working right now on a project of awareness across Canada to help bring in more newcomers and tourism to those municipalities.
Merci. La francophonie canadienne est diverse.
Thank you. Francophonie canadienne is diverse, and it is growing by leaps and bounds. thanks to the arrival of Francophone newcomers. What are your initiatives and tools in place in order to ensure the success of these newcomers? And have you come up with initiatives to encourage them to venture into the business, Mr. Boucher? Our Francophone immigration strategy is in place, has been in place for quite some time. And this week, we're actually celebrating the 20th anniversary and the 10th anniversary of the Réseau d'Immigration Francophone. And we work with different governments. We started with the province back then in terms of our working relations and work on immigration. We are currently working especially with the federal government. The fact that we have the Réseau d'Immigration Francophone brings several players into play. This is an integrated approach, a global approach, which is not done by a single organization. And employment services are provided, housing services are provided, and these are really key aspects when it comes to settling, enabling newcomers, Francophone newcomers to settle in and start their life in Canada. So following up on the lives of these newcomers is really important. I think one of the key aspects is employment. Thank you, Mr. Boucher and Mr. Iacono. That's all the time we had. We'll continue with Mr. Beaulieu for 2.5 minutes. Thank you. I'd like to know, do you still have communities or municipalities that operate mainly in French? Well, in Alberta, there's still some communities in the northern part of the province which are aging populations where French was the predominant language. A member of the ABMA and communities like Saint Paul and Bonneville, which are aging population. We talked about the challenges in rural areas, and this is something that we need to work on to ensure that young people stay in their communities. Old Lake is more or less bilingual. There's a military base there. And in our rural communities, there's the issue of aging population, which is a major challenge when it comes to the survival and development of these communities. In the Saint-Pierre de la Sylverie community, council meetings are held completely in French, entirely in French, and this is really important that all the MPs are able to speak in both official languages. And we also have discussions in English and French in the Richard-Tétaché municipality and all other municipalities where there's a higher concentration of Francophones, but we work in both official languages in most cases. Francophone immigration. If you have new Francophone newcomers settling in communities where there are very few Francophones, do you think this will be more efficient for them to be able to obtain information and to settle in communities or municipalities where French is the language of administration? Essentially, we encourage them to be part of our rural Francophone communities, but at the same time, I think we talked about this earlier, each person needs to be able to secure a job, to be able to live decently and support their family's needs. So sometimes the choices are not that obvious. But of course, we have an initiative called Communauté Francophone Accueillante, and the goal of this initiative is to attract people in our communities and in our bilingual municipalities across Manitoba. That is the objective, but of course, it's always easier said than done for individuals who have very hard choices to make. 25 seconds, Mr. Beaulieu. Ms. Ashton, over to you for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much. Once more, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Boucher. We heard during this survey on work organized by CEDEM, especially the event Destination Manitoba. And we know, obviously, that based on Act Bill C-13, we have more ambitious immigration targets. We'd like to have even more ambitious immigration targets. But talking about this initiative from CEDEM, do you believe that this contributes to stimulate local economic development by highlighting the opportunities in the province for Francophone communities and the business community at large? Do you think it's important to get federal support for such initiatives in the long term? Absolutely. Thank you, Ms. Ashton, for your question. I think the important thing when it comes to connections with Francophone immigration is to know each other, to hear more about the region, to be there face to face, and to understand exactly the situation in which we find ourselves. I believe that these initiatives only go a long way to support and encourage Francophone immigration, which is a bit more structured and is based on different aspects, including employment. I believe that the federal government clearly has a role to play here because it is this kind of initiative which has proven to work that enables us to be able to recruit even more people who can work in our communities and who can settle here in French in Manitoba. Thank you very much. With the last seconds that I have left, I'd like to share the same question which I asked to Mr. Boucher regarding the job cuts at CBC Radio. Mr. Alary, I wanted to check with you in Alberta, are you concerned by these job losses and the impact of this on Francophone communities in where you are? This is a major concern, especially when you take into account the number of job losses. There's going to be significant consequences on our regional stations. A cut in Manitoba, Alberta, or Saskatchewan has a significant effect when it comes to covering our Francophone communities. And this is unfortunate that a state-owned corporation has to get to this. We understand that there's a difficult financial context today, and the fact that they have less revenue from advertisement. And so I think we're trying to rationalize certain things. We're saying, well, we'll have teams who'll try to be more efficient, but taking out a journalist on the field in Edmonton is the community that loses. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Alary. Thank you, Ms. Ashton. I'd like to thank all those around the table and those who are virtually present. I'd like you to greet Mr. Paul Lefebvre, former mayor and former member of the a permanent committee, a standing committee on official languages. And I'd like to thank you all for your presence. And I'd like to buttress Ms. Goodridge's point. It's really interesting to see Francophonie expressing itself from all provinces. It's interesting to hear Francophonie spoken about from other provinces besides Quebec and New Brunswick. I'd like to tell members that next Wednesday this week, there will be no committee meeting for the reasons that we determined last week. But just as a reminder, there will be no session on Wednesday. And I'd like to thank, on behalf of the committee, the support staff, our deputies and vice all the support staff of the committee, starting with the clerk, the analysts who help us, whose help is unquantifiable, all the IT support staff, the interpreters working virtually, who are doing an extraordinary job, as well as the future, Ms. Michaela, who come and adjourn the session for the day. Go on, Ms. Michaela.